Retro.
What's up, guys? This is Daniel Logan, Boba Fett from Attack of the Clones, The Clone Wars, Book of Boba, Skywalker Saga game, and hopefully many more things in the Star Wars galaxy. You are listening to Jay and Dennis on Podcast Stardust. Yep, this is the way I've spoken.
Welcome to Podcast Stardust. This is the fully armed and operational podcast dedicated to Star Wars news, reviews, and discussion. I'm Dennis Keithley.
And I'm Jay Krebs.
And this episode of Podcast Stardust is going to feature discussion of how Season 2 of Andor impacts our experience with Rogue One. Before we get into that, Jay, remind everybody what our social media contacts are.
Absolutely, Dennis. We are on Facebook and Instagram conveniently at Podcast Stardust.
All right, the digital line, the signal's boosted to maximum output, the shield's down, we're now broadcasting to the galaxy. So the inspiration for this episode comes from a quote from Diego Luna, and it was a few weeks ago, or maybe even before Season 2 of Andor debuted, but he basically said that Season 2 of Andor is going to change the way we see Rogue One. And so we're kind of putting that to the test. We've both rewatched the movie and after completing Season 2 of Andor. So we're going to kind of give our top 10 ways that Andor Season 2 has impacted how we perceive, how we view, how we look at Rogue One. So we're each going to take some turns here. And I don't know, it's not even really going to be a top 10 list. It's just going to be a list and we'll see how many we get. But with that said, Jay, I'll let you go first. What is the first way in which Andor Season 2 impacted your viewing of Rogue One?
Well, I think just in general, I mean, there's just a different, I don't want to necessarily say changed way that I look at Rogue One, but it's almost like I look at it now as a, if you know, kind of a feeling,
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when we first got Rogue One, obviously it was a very fresh story and it left us with that feeling that, oh my gosh, there was so much sacrifice that was made leading up to A New Hope that you didn't realize, when Luke was complaining about going to Tashi Station to pick up power converters, that all of this stuff was happening. And then now it even goes back even further and you see even the deeper roots of the rebellion and you see all of the things that have happened, even up to the point of Rogue One. And so I just feel like the relationships that we see in Rogue One are deepened even more. I mean, with things like understanding what was going on with Saw between times, what was going on with Mon Mothma between times. I mean, just knowing Melchi, you just feel like you just known him forever now at this point. And, the little lines, like, for example, we have always mentioned, I've been in this fight since I was 6 years old. This goes all the way back to Season 1, even of Andor, when we understand that Cassian, taken, by Marva when he was 6 and he truly was brought up on Ferrix and, truly living the life of a rebel since he was 6. And now we truly understand why. So, I mean, just in general, those are my impressions and truly a handing of a baton, off to each new, if you will, generation of rebels. And just, again, just makes that experience just so much more rich. But I definitely have some specific examples starting with the beginning of the movie, but that's just my overall.
Okay. Well, for me, I'm going to go more into the specific here. And right off the bat, it's the whole experience of Ring of Kafrene. This viewing, when I did, is like, okay, now I can kind of see why Cassian was so urgent once he got there. Yeah.
Yes.
And then on top of that, why Tivik was so urgent. His info resonates with Cassian when he gets there. And then I don't know that it necessarily excuses Cassian for having shot Tivik in the back, but I could also understand why he was now motivated to do so in this situation, which is, they had just gone through this experience where Luthen died, getting that information from Lonnie Young, and got it passed down to Cassian, and then Cassian delivered it, and he's not believed by the Rebel Council there. And now he's got this additional information from Tivik that helps confirm what he already knows. And they can't let the Empire onto the fact that they know about this now. So, Tivik had to go, unfortunately, in that situation. It made sense the way it was, but it enhanced that scene. And I don't know, did it need to be enhanced? I don't know that it did, but it definitely contributed something there.
No, and to springboard off of what you just said too, I mean, going back to what you mentioned with Diego Luna saying that season 2 of Andor, you can go right into Rogue One, and you truly can.
Mm-hmm.
And just, even little things that I thought were genius right off the bat was you hear Tivik say, there are spies everywhere.
Right.
And all I could think of was, I have friends everywhere. And there are so many little instances of quotes like that are kind of reversed in Rogue One that we've seen either in season 2 or even in season 1 of Andor, which there's another one coming up here later in the movie. But that was the very first thing. Instead of there are spies everywhere, I have friends everywhere,
Sure.
That just, that stood out.
Well, I'll have another comment on that in just a second, but what is the next one on your list?
Well, just the fact that, I started thinking to myself that I thought K2 and Andor were together for so much longer than they were up to the, events of Rogue One, and not to diminish their relationship whatsoever. But it's just almost like a whirlwind of a connection between the two of them when you think about how far they've come as partners in such a short time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had K2 on my list, so I'll go ahead and just kind of dovetail into that a little bit with what I was thinking. In that, I'm thinking of the opening scene where K2 and Melshi go get Jyn from Obani there. And yeah, I'm with you. You get the impression if you just watch Rogue One that those two had been together for years and years and years. They've been they've been partner and run tons and tons of missions over the years. Okay, you can put that aside. And now you've got K2 and Melshi going and doing this while Cassian is at the Ring of Kafrene here.
Mm.
And so does it drastically change the way I view that scene? No, it doesn't. But again, it's just kind of these two knuckleheads, with the two of the three knuckleheads are now here, are doing this mission here. And, right after Melshi gets bashed by Jyn, with this whole thing. And so again, it was just kind of a, okay, cool. A little bit of a, we see the friendship between these character type of moment. And this is why those two are where they are.
Right. Yeah. Coming from like playing the cards and the poker game or whatever around the table. And then now they don't have to just be K2 and Cassian. It can be K2 and Melchi too.
Yeah. I've got this is like several different points on my list, and I'm going to kind of combine it because I don't know how to talk about them individually. But moving further into the movie, they finally get back to Yavin 4, and Jyn is pleading her case to the Rebel Council about why they have to go do this, why they have to go to Scarif, they have to look for the Death Star plans. And she's ultimately not believed. And it's the two senators that I can't think of their names, right now, but we have to see them there. The one with a little scraggly beard, and then the darker lady who always has that gold hood like up over her head.
Right.
And they're just not giving her any traction with this. And then, Mon Mothma, apologizes to Jyn in that moment and says, sorry, Jyn, without the full support of the council, we can't do anything. And then right after that, Jyn goes out to report to Baze and Chirrut and talks about her frustration. And then Cassian shows up with everybody. And that's when, Rogue One's going to launch. Okay. So I've summarized that scene. But this is for me, this is the biggest moment that's enhanced by Andor. And it's because Cassian just went through the same thing with the Rebel Council that Jyn did. He got up there and then he was talking about everything that happened in order to get this here. And they doubted him. Luthen could have been being played by the Empire. Now Jyn shows up with additional information that she got fresh from her father's mouth, which was a name that Cassian brought back from Luthen, Jyn Erso there. And they still aren't believing it. And at this point, it's not just that Cassian suddenly became a believer in Jyn's mission, once they left Edu. It's that he's got more invested in this. He lost friends. He lost Luthen. He lost people
Mhm.
that he's worked with all this. And so this decision he's making, it has a much bigger impact.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And to the point that you just made as well, again, going back to those little quotes that we saw the first time around in Rogue One and thought to ourselves, "Oh, I wonder what he meant by that," when he
Mm-hmm.
says, "You're not the only one who lost everything."
Right.
And he says that to Jyn at one point. I mean, we understand now what the heck he means by that. And again, thinking about the reasons why he believed Jyn was because of Luthen and because of, as you just mentioned, the things that he went through with the council. And you get the feeling more after watching Andor as well that Mon's hands were a little bit more tied with the procedural kinds of things that she maybe was a little concerned and was a little cautious, but yet I think that she felt a little bit held back because you even see later on when they talk about leaving Draven leaving and that, and Mon kind of looks over and smiles, like
Right.
that's what she wanted to happen in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. All right. So
So,
what's next on your list?
another one for me was just the idea of, again, sort of passing the baton, where we saw that one bellhop say to Cassian, "Rebellions are built on hope." And
Mm-hmm.
then Cassian says that to Jyn, and then Jyn says that. And then eventually we get hope in the form of Leia. We kind of equivalate Leia with hope, and she even says that at the end. So it's one of those kind of lines in Star Wars that is kind of a catchphrase, but yet I'm a big one on passing the baton and tying together those generational kinds of things. And this isn't like generational in a way that you're talking about decades of time in between, but you're talking about different facets of the same diamond, if you will, in
Mm-hmm.
this way that are all sharing this phrase. And I just think that's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. That was on my list as well. And basically it was because when Cassian says that to Jyn in Jeddah, when they're there, she's like, hope. And he turns around, it's like, rebellions are built on hope. It's because he says it so earnestly there. And now we know why. For
Mm.
you, because of what the way that line was delivered to him on Gorman with everything that happened during Andor. And so it's, in addition to what you're saying, is like we've seen a path about where he picked that up and stuff like that, but it's why he believed that so much now. And it's just not a platitude. And they always delivered it more than it being a platitude in the movie, but
Sure.
with the background that they've got now, it's just got a little bit more meaning behind it.
Yes, for sure. And speaking of Gorman, yeah, I have to point out when they're in the holy city there in Jeddah, and you can see Cassian's kind of freaking out. He's like, "This whole place is about to blow." He
Mhm.
just was fresh off the Gorman massacre, and now here they are in the middle of Jeddah City, and they've got everything falling apart, and they've got stormtroopers blowing things up, and they have rebels shooting at each other, and they've got all of these things happening, and so that's fresh off of his experience, and so you can understand why he's even more agitated, if you will, with everything that's going on at that point.
Yeah, that was on my list as well. That was actually the next one I was going to bring up. It was that the experience there, just having watched, actually, I guess 2 years ago at this point, by comparison, having watched what the Empire was willing to do to Gorman in order to get the result they wanted. In that case, I can't remember the mineral that they wanted from Gorman, so they were willing to make patsies out of the gore in order to get it done. Well, in this case, it's very similar. They wanted the Kyber crystal off of Jeddah, and they needed that pilot, and so it was completely sacrificial. And once they got it, it was a matter of kind of covering their tracks, and they made an example out of Jeddah,
Yeah.
which is kind of hard to say because then they would go on to say it was a mining accident. But the point was that they tested the super weapon there. They were not afraid to sacrifice these people. And yeah, it was Cassian's lines like, this place is ready to blow. Well, I think he maybe was saying it figuratively, but literally it was about to blow up. So,
Mhm.
but I'll go ahead and get into my next one here. And this is not necessarily a really, really big one, but it's just kind of the elimination of any potential romance between Cassian and Jyn here, because they make it clear in Andor that, he wanted to be with Bix, but
Hmm.
she left in order to remove any doubt, remove any distraction from him so that he could see this mission to an end. They could overthrow their empire and they could finally be together, because it's an evil that had to be defeated here. And there's just these moments in Rogue One, like, when they're coming down the elevator after getting the plans transmitted scarce, they're just kind of looking at each other, and then the embrace at the end. And if you wanted to, you could read some sort of a romantic interest in that. But it's just, you didn't have to either. You could say it's just kind of the circumstances as well. But now that we got Andor, we kind of understand what Cassian desires in all this. Why, part of the reason why he was so urgent, it's not just because of the Death Star, it's that the Empire could take control. He's never going to have that life with Bix if
Right.
he wanted. Literally know what his fate was going to be, but still.
Right. Yeah. Even at the end of Andor, when you know what's happening and what's waiting for him, you just be like, no, don't go, don't go. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And I mean, even with Baze calling Jyn little sister, that's kind of puts it into perspective too. And translating that even to Cassian, because I mean, he's quite a bit, I wouldn't say quite a bit older than Jyn, but he, old enough, I think,
Mm-hmm.
to that extent. But yeah, I'm totally with you that you totally see that as off the table. Like whoever, if it
Sure.
was ever on the table, it is totally off the table now, for sure, for sure.
Indeed.
Yeah, yeah.
So what's next on your list?
Well, the next one again is just one of those things with quotes and things that have been turned around from either Andor season 1 or Andor season 2. And this one specifically is from Andor season 1. There was an entire episode called Nobody's Listening.
Mm-hmm.
And that was season 1, episode 9. I had to go back and look at it. And Cassian yells that nobody's listening. And then as soon as they transmit the plans to the of the Death Star, Cassian looks at Jyn and says, "Do you think anybody's listening?"
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
and I was like, "Oh my gosh, that is such a great full circle moment." I love that.
Yeah. Completely different context, which is like, the Empire is not paying attention to us. Now we're hoping that the rest of the galaxy is
Right.
in
Yeah.
this
And
situation.
he was almost like tongue in cheek, like, "Do you think anybody's listening?" Like he knew they were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, I
Yeah.
love that.
Right. And then, for me on my next one on the list, it's Saw Gerrera on this. And
Mhm.
we'd had hints of his development from appearances in Rebels and Jedi Fallen Order and the like. But season 2 really drove home the evolution of this character in these years leading up to Rogue One. And the madness that he's kind of developed, the radium that he wants to sniff because of just kind of,
Yes.
it's the only thing that understands me, whatever that line was there, him calling up the rebel council on Yavin and yelling at them about, it's like, it's funny, we're always told that this is the rebellion's bigger than us, but then when I need something, we're too small. And just this kind of, I I saw this somewhere. It's just like this idea that he randomly calls up the rebels and yells at them because he just got gripes, and then mentioning that he's got spies. How many spies do you have on the Mets? And then Tivik makes even references that they're spies that the rebellion is placed inside of, and Cassian makes a reference to that as well, inside the Cavern Angels. The partisans that Saw's got working for him there. But the biggest thing is just kind of when the Death Star has tested its weapon on the Holy City with a single reactor, and the terrain is peeling away from the impact of the blast and it's coming towards his headquarters, he finally decides to give up the fight at this point. And he yells after Jyn, save the rebellion, save the dream. In this case, I don't know that it necessarily explains that anymore, but I get it more in this situation, because when we saw him back in season 1 of Andor, he was still fully a man. By the time we got to see him the last time in Andor in season 2, he was the guy we saw in Rogue One. He's half machine, half man. He's kind of like Darth Vader in that regards.
Right.
He is the rebel
Right.
version of Vader. And he's been through so much. And now here's the Empire showing up with this super weapon. He can try and run. He can't run. He's no condition to do that anymore. But he can pass on the mission to Jyn and kind of acquiesce to the rebellion. So I got that a little bit more, I think.
No, I'm totally with you. And for Saw, he is such a I often use the term beautiful disaster, but he
Mhm.
really is. And I'm kind of convinced, I don't know if convinced, but I'm wondering very heavily if it's not oxygen that he's sucking through that tube, but actually the rhydonium gas. Because every time he does it, it gives him like that clarity almost, and like he's just like, Borgullet, like, he
Mhm.
almost gets this, like, crazy look in his eye kind of a thing, like he did when he was talking about it, being his sister and everything. So, I don't know, I kinda wonder if it's the gas, not actually oxygen that he's sucking on.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I've always looked at it as, he's a mess. And I'm doing that whole Darth Vader comparison here. Darth Vader has got a breathing apparatus to help him stay alive here. And I kind of feel like maybe Saw doesn't have that. Maybe I doubt it's pure iodonium because he just would have died if that's what he
Oh,
was
sure.
sniffing.
Right.
But, maybe it's a little bit of that, but he needs some oxygen in order to live, because I got to believe that he talked about people falling dead from sniffing that stuff. And
Mhm.
so has he done enough of it that he's wrecked his lungs that he needs the oxygen? But regardless of whether he's sniffing that or not, we can see that there were, it can't be just that he got shot up that put him in this condition. There's got to be long-term effects that whatever he's sniffing there is helping him with from that
Yes.
we got to see in Andor season 2. So
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
good. All right. So yeah, Saw Gerrera. What else do you have on your list?
Well, there was I had on here Cassian and Force users because I don't know completely if I have reconciled the way that Cassian truly feels about them because,
Hmm.
in the series when he was, with that Force healer, he was very resistant of
Hmm.
that, and now he's got Baze and Chirrut who are guardians of the wills, and they're not Jedi per se, but they're in, the same sort of realm as this Force healer, and it's not that he doesn't ever fully trust them because obviously they were on his team and he was trusting them with his life, but I don't know if he ever reconciled any of that. But how do you feel about his relationship with Force users?
That's a thing I hadn't considered until you brought it up. That's a good addition to the list. Because I don't know that we ever got the source of his distrust in Andor,
Right.
other than just he just had one for this Force
Exactly.
healer. And I was, at least during Andor, I was attributing part of that to stubbornness. When it comes down to him, it's that he's good at taking care of himself. He's been doing that. He's got this uh, aggravated relationship with the rebellion and things like that. Now you got this woman who he's kind of looking at as a charlatan that's
Mhm.
supposedly going to heal this blaster wound when the medicines and stuff that he's taking could not. The That is something that they could have, and I would like to have seen during the course of season 2 of Andor, is an encounter with some Force user that soured him on this, because he says in the course of Rogue One, it's like, oh, they're the guardians of the wills, but they're they protect the kyber crystal, but now they don't have a job anymore, so they're just making things bad for everybody. I can't remember exactly how he
Right.
puts those
Yeah.
lines
Yeah.
there. And so I don't know if in that moment he's really agitated with them because of their Force users, or it's just because they aren't, they had a job, protect the kyber crystal kyber, and now they're not doing that. So, but they're also not helping anything.
Mhm.
And so, is that why he's just frustrated on that with
Yeah.
them? Yeah.
Yeah, could be, could be. But I will say with Chirrut, when he says that line to Cassian about prisons, and he says,
Yeah.
"Oh, I sense you carry yours with you wherever you go."
Yeah.
Wow, does that speak volumes after watching Andor? That's
Hmm.
a line that's like, "Ooh, okay." Again, it's one of those if you know kind of things.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go ahead and dive into this. I was going to save it for later, but it's going to match up well with what you're just talking about. And that's in Andor. we get all these references to the Emperor, but we never see him. And we still don't see him in Rogue One. So he's still the boogeyman. And we still don't see him in A New Hope after that, when it comes down to it.
True.
But after all this talk of the Emperor and everything, we finally get his right-hand man and Darth Vader here. And so it's kind of like the absence of the Sith, the absence of Jedi, the absence of people using lightsabers in Andor. If you watch that and then you go into Rogue One, it's all of a sudden you get Darth Vader, especially with the hallway scene where he's slaughtering rebels with his lightsaber. It did something for the I don't want to overstate it, but it did something for the impact of Darth Vader there. You know, Andor, other than the Force healer, really keeps his hands off the Force this entire time. You know, and then Rogue One is kind of like the transition to A New Hope in that regard, in that it starts to, you know, it brings in a Sith. You've got Jyn saying, "May the Force be with us," and people, and then Chirrut's role, you know, he believes in the Force. I'm with the Force, and the Force is with me. You know, that type of role. And then Baze has his doubts, and then they come back. So it really is just kind of this: the Force has been gone from the galaxy over the course of Andor. You know, these 5 years that we've watched, and now it's coming back in Rogue One.
Yes. Yes. And Rogue One is such a great bridge between, you know, obviously Andor and A New Hope too, because even, you know, I've said this before, when K2 says, "I've got a bad feeling about," and they're like, "Hey, K2, you know, K, stop." Like, he doesn't finish the line, and it's because they're not quite there yet, you know, and they're preserving that for later kind of thing.
Got anything else on your list?
Well, Melchi, I mean, again, just getting to know him, and then his death definitely hit a lot harder in Rogue One, just watching it again from, you know, again, just getting to know him during Andor, and just all of the relationships that he had with Cassian all the way up through from Narkina 5 and, you know, the rebellion and those initial seeds. So that was a lot harder to watch.
Yeah. So, you know, some that are not real big deals here, but again, the understanding of why kyber crystals are so important, after, again, that being part of that message that Lonnie gave to Luthen, Luthen gave to Clea gave to Cassian and everybody there. You know, she was talking about, you know, kyber crystals, Jedha, Galen Erso, you know, that type of stuff, rattling off all those things. So, you know, a little bit of an enhancement there. I don't know that changes the way I look at it. And then along those lines, just K-2SO himself, we saw how much punishment and how much damage those KX droids could do in Andor, you know, and Gorman, you know, they're just wreaking havoc during the riot. And then K2 storms the apartment building on Coruscant, you know, and wanders in there and lays down the law by throwing around those Imperials and using one as a shield for everything, you know, and doesn't think anything of it. And then same thing happens here. He gets concerned about Cassian, so he no longer stays put on the ship, the U-wing on Jeddah, and he's like, you know, I was bored and you were in trouble. So, you know, he shows up and does something about it. So again, it's kind of understanding K2's character, and it just added a bit of depth there. Do I see K2 differently? No, but I got some more depth to him based on a pattern behavior that's now established in Andor.
Right, right. Well, you know, he was sort of give you the impression in Rogue One that he was this gentle giant, you know, that he was strong when he had to be, but he was very almost childlike and innocent and naive in a lot of ways. And that is still true, but I couldn't help but to think, you know, when Jyn was trying to get off of that transport on Wobani, and K2 grabs her by her throat and slams her down and is like, "Congratulations, you are being rescued." Like, if he would have slammed her hard enough, he could have killed her, you know, based on what we saw in Andor. So he must have really used a very light touch in comparison to what obviously he could have done.
I think I've been through most of my points on my list here. Do you have anything else before we wrap this up?
The only other thing that I could think of is Krennic, and just the way that, you know, there was that line, and I know we've mentioned it at least one other time before, where Tarkin talks about the security breaches
Yeah.
And, and Krennic says the breaches have all been filled. Well, we thought it was just Jeddah, but we know now from watching Andor that it was more than just Jeddah.
Yeah. I actually overlooked that on my list as well. I did want to talk about Krennic here. We understand more about why he's frustrated in Rogue One and his interactions with Tarkin, especially because
Yes.
we saw what he just went through to get the minerals he needed off of Gorman to complete the Death Star. And then we saw what he went through, like you said, plugging the security breaches, that confrontation he had with Dedra when she was in custody after things about the Death Star were getting out there. And now he's got the Death Star finished and Tarkin's taken away from him.
Mm-hmm.
And we just, we've seen his last 4 years of his life, the 4 years preceding this one over season 2 of Andor. And it's just like, and when he yells, we stand here amongst my achievement, not yours. We now know precisely why that is. Again, I don't know that it changes anything, but it enhances in this regard. So
Definitely. Yes, a lot of enhancements
yeah,
for sure. A lot of more depth.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So that gets us to our final question of all this. After discussing all this, has Andor really changed the way you see Rogue One? Or because I'm leaning towards it's enhanced more than anything, because I don't know that I necessarily watch Rogue One any differently, but it is certainly enhanced the way I look at the film.
Yes, and I would agree. And back to what I said, at the very beginning, it gives you more insight, kind of like if you know kind of feeling that when you watch Rogue One now, you can see exactly why things happened the way that they did, exactly how things came to be the way that they are. When Mon gives those little side eyes, why she's doing those kinds of things. So again, it hasn't really changed it, but it's definitely given it a lot more depth.
Indeed.
For sure.
Okay.
The only thing that's changed is really the whole Jyn and Cassian possibility of romance thing.
Yeah,
That's
but in the end,
completely
that's an element of the film. It's not like the message of the film. It's not
Sure.
the conveyance of the film. And that's what, when people say it's going to change the way you live your life, it's going to change the way you see this. It's like, no, it doesn't really change the way I see it. It just maybe clarifies a little bit. I don't know. It was just cinema, I suppose, for C. But yeah, this really, it enhances is the most I can say. And it's a good thing. I mean,
Yes.
Rogue One is richer for having Han Andor. But anyway.
Oh, for sure.
All right. Well, there is our conclusion to our question. So that'll wrap up this episode. Thank you all for joining us for this episode of Podcast Stardust and this installment of the show where we're talking about Andor's impact on Rogue One. We hope you've enjoyed it. I don't know if we have anything like this coming up exactly anytime soon, but any chance we can get to talk about Rogue One. And that was the highlight of doing this, was getting to watch Rogue One again. I hadn't sat down and watched that movie from start to finish in a while.
Right.
Was fantastic. But we're always up for talking about that. I'm sure we're going to want to talk about Andor in the future. So if you've hit that subscribe button, you'll get those episodes when we get to them. But we got a lot of other great things coming up, and we'll hope you'll be around to join us for those. And once you've done that, we'd appreciate if you could do things like rate, review, and the podcast on your podcatcher choice if it supports such things. That helps drive all those algorithms that help the show get noticed by others, and that would be a big favor to us. And if you're looking for more Podcast Stardust beyond what you're going to get on your podcatcher choice, head over to directorsapp.com, which is the home of the podcast, as well as several other great podcasts such as Agent Shield Case Files, Animaniacast, Brews and Blasters, Dork Lair, Doomcast, Enjoy Stuff, Love, Death, and Robots Plus, Superhero Suite, and Warp Trails. Jay, you want to go ahead and hit up those social media contacts one more time, as well as where else we can be found on the internet?
Absolutely. So you can always find us on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust, very similar to Project Stardust, which is where we get our name. And we also have our Pinterest boards that we maintain. So if you want to find all kinds of fun ideas for everything Star Wars, you can head over there. And then we also have our YouTube outlets, including the traditional YouTube as well as YouTube Music. So hit us up over there. Let us know what you thought of this episode and if there's anything else you'd love to add. And we'd love to hear what you have to say. And if you are in need of some new Project Stardust or Podcast Stardust, I keep saying Project Stardust. Got that on the brain. Items for your wardrobe or for your home or office, we do have a store on TeePublic, and the link to that is in our show notes. And we do have 7 different show logo designs available on all kinds of fun things. And so if you do happen to pick something up please know that every one of those purchases does help to support the show. And if you snag something, please take a picture and tag us, because we always love to see where those things end up out in the wild.
All right, you remind everybody what's going on in cosplay.
Sure. So on my Instagram, which is at j.snipscosplay, you can always catch me as Ahsoka, the fourth sister, two different versions of Hera, as well as my original concept Mandalorian, and much, much more. So you can always see what I'm up to there. And I'm always supporting other cosplayers and content creators, small business owners, and the like. And once again, that is at j.snipscosplay.
Okay, upcoming on the show on Friday, we'll be looking at recent Star Wars news, assuming there is any, and if there's not, then we will pivot to something else. And then on Monday, we are looking at the third and final episode of Season 2 of Light and Magic, so make sure you're around for that. So with that, thanks for listening to episode 895 of Podcast Stardust, everyone. Have a great rest of your week, and until next time, may the Force be